So I'll provide you with several reasons to study consumer behavior. So reason number one, firms, whether they're marketing products, services, so on and so forth, exist to satisfy consumers' needs. So firms must understand those needs in order to satisfy them. So we often think of consumers as being or having this black box, right? So we know that we can use environmental stimuli as well as marketing stimuli to affect the consumer, right? So environmental stimuli such as cultural stimuli, such as political stimuli, demographic stimuli, psychological stimuli, as well as the P's, right? We can use price, promotion, place, processes, so on and so forth to affect consumers. What we don't know though is what happens when those stimuli what happens when the marketing piece or environmental stimuli is then kind of shown to or given, provided, whatever you want to use to the consumer, we don't necessarily know what the response will be, right? And the reason, again, is this idea that consumers are this black box, and there are so many different things that go into the consumer psyche and the consumer mind. We don't exactly know what a cause effect relationship will look like, right? So if I remind you that you're a woman, sure, you might respond in a manner similar to women. But I don't know what that looks like when it also includes marketing stimuli. I don't know what that looks like when it's not just your gender, but it's your gender and your politics, or your gender and your culture, or your gender, your politics, and your culture, right? And so we're constantly trying to figure out ways to understand what's going on in this black box so we can predict this response. Remember, our goal is to pretty much predict behavior, to predict attitudes, to know the consumer so well that our products, our services, our ideas, so on and so forth, sell themselves. When we talk about that black box, there are things we need to realize that go into the box, right? So, culture, personality, their life stage, whether they're 20 or 80, their income, their attitudes, their motivation, so on and so forth, all are inside the black box that is consumer thinking, consumer cognition, behavior, emotions, so on and so forth. And those are things, along with organizational influences like brands and advertising and promotion, that ultimately affect things like obtaining a product, consuming a product, and disposing of a product. But we also know that things aren't very cut and dried. So we'd like to believe that things are really cut and dry in terms of how consumers make decisions, but it's not. And let me give you an example. How many people have noticed the ads that they receive on their cell phone or on the side of their computer screen, so on and so forth? I'm sure you have. And there's research that shows that these targeted ads aren't just likely to make you want to buy things, they can actually change how you think about yourself. So first of all, and this makes sense, targeted ads usually increase interest in the product, right? So if you know, for example, I love to read, and someone starts sending me targeted ads for, let's say, books, they know that those ads are likely to increase my interest in buying the book. What else might happen though? Well, it turns out that as I said, these ads may change the way you think about yourself. And so how did they find this out? This is kind of interesting. Some researchers from Ohio State looked into this, and they found out that if you receive a targeted ad for a luxury good, you are more likely to think, wow, these advertisers must really think that I can A, afford a luxury good, and B, that I'm the type of person who matches with this luxury good. So if you are browsing Yahoo or wherever you browse, I don't know, and you see an ad on the side for a Jaguar, what they found is that you start feeling good about yourself. right? Now, on its face, most people wouldn't have assumed that that's true. But the fact of the matter is that consumers are quite complex. And so understanding how something like targeted ads affects the consumer is pretty important as a marketer, right? I want to know not just kind of, hey, will putting a targeted ad there affect sales? Right? Will it actually increase interest in the product? Will it increase the bottom line? But how do consumers respond above and beyond sales, right? What they didn't look at in this study, and I guess we could think about, is what happens if you put a targeted ad for something that's significantly cheaper than a Jaguar. So, I don't know, something that you would associate with less money. So, what if you started receiving targeted ads for, I don't know, baked beans? I should tell you, I don't like baked beans, but I do like beans. I don't consider beans to be low quality. Some people might, though. But what happens to the consumer if they start receiving ads on the side for something like baked beans versus a Jaguar, right? What kind of psychological consequences um, might happen, right? Or a question that I kind of pose on this slide is, and one of the things they didn't study in this research is, can retailers share these psychological consequences, right? So if I see if I see a targeted ad on the side for a Jaguar and it makes me feel really good about myself, does that not only increase my interest in Jaguar, will it increase my interest in a pair of, let's say, relatively expensive heels that I might see later on while I'm doing my online browsing? These are questions I don't know, but these are questions that a consumer behavior researcher might seek to discover, and that would be important to retailers and marketers. So here's a think break question for you. Let's say you own a men's clothing store and your revenues have not increased in the last year despite a steady increase in foot traffic. People are coming to your store, they're just not spending more. You've tried offering sales, you've increased your advertising and your personal selling via store employees. What new ideas do you have? Emphasis on new. What new ideas might you have? Take a few minutes and think about that. So every time I pose the question on what would you do to increase sales, inevitably someone says, I'd have a restaurant, right? Like one of those situations where scantily clad women are walking around the store to convince shoppers to buy the food. I never understand that answer, right? I already said earlier that there's personal selling going on. I'm not sure that half-naked women will necessarily encourage a guy to buy a shirt, but maybe. I'm not a guy. I don't know. Open up the store. You should open that store and see how it works. What I will say that research has shown will work is doing something like painting everything red. And what do I mean by that? Actually putting sales tags on things and making sure that those sales tags are the color red. Why? Well, from an evolution standpoint, men love the color red. Puccinelli and all in 2013 have a journal of retailing showing that the effect of red versus black prices on perceptions of savings is influenced by gender. And specifically, male consumers perceive greater savings when prices are presented in red than when presented in black. Why is this the case? Why is it that a guy will walk into a store and say, "Oh, these people mean business. This sales tag is in red." And according to Puccinelli et al., this is absolutely not the case with women. Women do not pay attention to the color of the sales ad or the color of the sales sticker or anything like this. Why is it that men do? You tell me. Well, I would argue, and I am assuming you might as well, women might be more familiar with shopping. Research has shown women do more shopping than men, and so women may not be as quote unquote deceived by red pricing. women may be thinking about pricing in terms of relative pricing. So they were in another store last week. They saw a similar shirt that was $45. When they walk in your store, if that same shirt is 44, they're not going to perceive a sale. On the other hand, for men who probably shop less, and I'm not saying every man does, but for men who do, um, then they might not know about the shirt from last week that was $45. They might see the $44 shirt in red and go, wow, what savings? Because as you know, a lot of retailers will say, used to be $90, now it's 44. So this is something that we know because of consumer behavior research. Okay, we can't really talk about consumer behavior without talking about consumption. We're defining um, consumption is a process of using the product, the service, the idea, so on and so forth, right? So it could be that you buy yourself some Ben and Jerry's. You decide that you want to eat the Ben and Jerry's. You eat it immediately, or the very next week you do the same, except this time you wait a few days and keep it as a treat for yourself. In either case, that is consumption. Um, you can do the exact same thing actually with ideas, right? So this may have happened to you before. Someone had an idea, you thought, hey, this isn't a bad idea. I'm going to kind of take that idea and use it. You want to consume the idea, quote unquote. Um, but maybe it takes you quite a while before you get back around to that idea, right? So maybe you think to yourself, you see an ad on how you should volunteer for the next election, and you think to yourself, yeah, I'll do that, but you don't sign up until not the next election, but the one after that, right? How consumers use a product or service affects satisfaction with that product or service. I use product a lot. FYI for you, I mean service as well as any other consumption related good or service or whatever. So, how you use a product affects your satisfaction with that product. Um, so I'll give you an example. I bought myself a Roomba. I have to say nothing but good things about it. Genius invention. Bought myself a Roomba. I tend to enjoy the Roomba much, much more when I turn it on for maintenance than when I try to turn it on for cleaning, right? So if I use it regularly, a couple times a week, it's amazing, right? Couple times a week, it's amazing. It makes sure my floor is clean, no hassle. If I wait for an entire week to use it, I have hardwood floors. My floors look a mess, and I hate using it because so much gets caught up in the little Roomba that I'm having to pull out. Um, Again, how you use it affects your satisfaction. It also affects kind of how long the product will last, right? So I'll give you an example. When I was growing up, I always got one pair of shoes at the beginning of the school year, tennis shoes, of course, and another um, after Christmas break, right? So in January, I get another pair of tennis shoes for the second half of the year. On the other hand, my brother would get, I would say, so that means I got what, two pair of shoes? My brother would get somewhere between 4 to 6. And my mom would justify it by saying, he's hard on his shoes. He's so much harder on his shoes. Which, of course, makes you think to yourself, I need to be harder on my shoe. No, I'm joking. I didn't do that. So, one fairly infamous quote is that people don't buy products for what they do, but for what they mean. Um, and we see this a lot in consumer behavior. If we're thinking about what the meaning of consumption really is, and people buying products or services or ideas or time, whatever, um, for what they mean, then the question is, what kind of meaning do you associate with different offerings? So, I'll give you an example. A friend of mine did the capsule wardrobe for a few months where she only kept 10 items of clothing, and she kept wearing those same 10 items of clothing, mixing and matching for I think about 3 months. And what they do, what the wardrobe does, is that it shows you that you don't need a huge amount of clothing. Most people don't pay attention to what you're wearing. She never got any comments. Even her boyfriend never noticed. And equally important,
that doing something like this makes you reflect on what's in your actual closet. And the other, like, I think resounding thing that they tell you is that most people buy the same type of clothes over and over and over. So I'm a woman, I love dresses. If you go into my closet, you will see several dresses that probably look very similar. Maybe one has a buckle and one's a different color, so on and so forth. But we just tend to keep buying the same stuff over and over. And so, what's the meaning of having a huge closet filled with very similar stuff versus having a capsule wardrobe? On similar but different lines, what meaning do people get from shopping at fast fashion stores? What's the meaning behind fast fashion for a lot of consumers? I, for one, would argue that being able to be stylish and not having to pay a huge amount of money are goals that people have, and that's the meaning they attach to fast fashion. I'm sure you can probably think of better reasons, and so take a minute and think about it. How then does the meaning of consumption change when we start talking about experiences? So, as I'm sure you know, people are buying experiences more so than goods, tangential products. We're still buying goods, clothes and shoes and those kind of things, but we're putting more of our money towards experiences. And it's not just millennials, as we like to believe. If you look on the right, you'll see that roughly the same amount of or percentage of people are trying to spend more money on experiences, right? So if you look at it by age, Generation X, millennials, and baby boomers, you see very little difference between those groups. On the other hand, if you look at income, you do see a much more significant difference. People that make more money are more apt to spend more money on experiences as a percentage of their income. What does that tell you? It might tell you as a marketer that you should market heavily to people who make $80,000 or more, right? Or people who just make more money. It could also tell you that maybe there's an opportunity there to create experiences for people that have less money, right? It's obvious that people who have less money still want to buy experiences, but maybe they can't. And so maybe that's an opportunity for an industrious person in this class. I think this is pretty interesting. If you look at the meaning of experiences to consumers, if you're looking for information on the meaning of experiences to consumers, this is great data. What they find here is that 60% of millennials, 60% say experiences are better when shared on social media. That's massive. You see this trend going down though by age, where it just drops and drops and drops until you get to the 65 and older, and you see this difference of more than one third between 65 and older and millennials. And so when you think about the meaning of consumption for millennials, you have to assume that for a lot of them, the meaning is being able to post it on social media. That is a part of what they want. And so, if you're a restaurant, make plate your food really fancy so people can take a picture and post it on social media. If you're, a theme park, give people the opportunity to take pictures with um, characters, so on and so forth, so that they can share those experiences. Apparently, the experiences in and of themselves aren't necessarily good enough for millennials. And so that's something that marketers need to think about. And that says something, I think, about the meaning of consumption for millennials. When we look at the meaning of consumption, there is a consumption typology that has been created by Holt. And essentially, he identifies four distinct types of consumption activities. The first, consuming is experience, where you have this emotional or aesthetic reaction to consumption objects. I remember going to see the Sistine Chapel, and I also remember going to the Vatican. And for me, I did have this kind of emotional reaction as well as an aesthetic reaction to both places. Consuming is integration, where you get to express aspects of yourself or society. So, one way that we could look at this, we see that people will buy tennis shoes now and customize them. So our previous provost, Keith Whitfield, lives in my building. And one day I was getting my car and I saw him. We start chatting, and he's wearing a pair of green Nikes, and on the back of them they say Provost, right? So he wants to express that aspect of himself. You could also want to express a certain aspect of society or a social setting, right? There's a reason that people wear jerseys when they go to games, right? They want to be a part of the crowd. Consuming is classification, where you want to communicate your association with objects. You could wear a Wayne State T-shirt, for example, or you could wear, a Tigers hat, so on and so forth. So you can show people that you're um, associated with certain things. And last but not least, consuming is play. This means you're participating in a mutual group experience and you're merging yourself with the group. You can think of this as your family. You could think of this as, what was I going to say, fraternity, sorority, whatever group that you merge yourself within. So the belief that consumers can form relationships with their consumption offerings. So what we call consumption relationships. So some people might have a self-concept attachment, right? So the product or service or idea, time, whatever it is, whatever the offering is, helps to establish the user's identity. So you could say something like wearing LeBron James's jersey helps to establish your identity as a person who supports LeBron James or the Lakers. You could say that going to a Trump rally, for example, helps to establish the user's identity. It reinforces that they like Trump, and it reinforces that the idea or the fact that they want other people to know that they like Trump. You could say that being in college helps to establish your identity, right? So if you're a first generation college student, it might establish your identity as someone who wants to further their education. At the same time, you could say that deciding to follow in the path of your parents or become a plumber or whatever, these things help establish your identity. You could also have nostalgic attachment. So a product or service or offering or whatever can serve as a link with your past self. So I'll give you an example. A friend of mine and I go on vacation every year. I met this friend my first year in college, so as an undergrad. And since then, we've been good friends. A couple of years ago, I want to say 2 years ago, we decided to visit my old college, which is also her old college. So we took a trip down to Mizzou. I needed to go for a wedding. But when we took the trip down there to Columbia, Missouri, we decided to walk around Mizzou's campus. What made us do that? Nostalgia. We go to the bookstore and we both spend an obscene amount of money. What made us do that? Nostalgia, right? Another attachment type is interdependence. It could be a part of your daily routine. Maybe there's a particular perfume or cologne that you wear, a particular kind of toothpaste, a particular kind of shoe, so on and so forth. And then the last type of attachment is what we call love. At the end of the day, there are indeed people who fall in love with their possessions, right? So people who absolutely love their car or their house or their jewelry, so on and so forth. So when we think about the meaning of consumption, we usually think about these four attachment styles as well as other things.
We can't really think about consumer behavior, right? Influencing others' shopping patterns, their ideology, their activities, so on and so forth, without thinking about all of these influences on consumer behavior. It's not just the marketer speaking to the consumer. We know that there are situational influences, right? There are influences that may come from a shopping or buying situation. Um, so, for example, what happens when you go to the mall and you're ready to spend money, but it's bombarded with, people who drive you crazy. So let's say it's bombarded with, I'm not saying this would drive me crazy, but let's say you go to the mall, you're ready to buy some clothes, and you get there, and there's a huge, and I'm talking like 300 or 400 toddlers, right? And they're loose at the mall running around. What do you do? Well, if it's me, I just leave the mall, right? I tend to like kids. I don't have any of my own, but I like kids. But the one thing that I know from having nieces and nephews is that there's a limit on how many I can deal with at one time. And so I wouldn't spend my money. That's a situational influence. There may be psychological influences that affect you. For example, um, what happens when you go to the mall and you just had an argument with your boyfriend or girlfriend, right? You're at the mall, you just had an argument with your boyfriend or girlfriend or your significant other. What happens? How much money do you spend? Are you happy at the mall? Are you paying attention to the small details? When you pass by a store, do you notice what's in the window? I'm going to guess that those are things that are going to be impacted by the fact that you're upset from the argument that you had. There are sociocultural influences, right? Influences that come from society and our social surroundings. So, I'll give you an example here in Detroit. Apparently, Detroiters love Coney dogs. I've never been to a city that promotes Coney dogs as much as Detroit. I'm sure there are a lot of people here who love to eat Coney dogs because of sociocultural influences. And then, of course, you have the marketing mix influences, where the marketer actually does influence your purchases or your decision to consume services or television shows or whatever, right? So, how marketers manipulate, price, place, product promotion, so on and so forth.
I'll talk about situational influence as well. I mentioned it before that the situation can affect how consumers respond to marketing, right? I talked about being angry with your partner and how that would affect you, and your ability to listen, comprehend, and agree with a political advertisement. Or even think about being angry at your partner and going to the mall. I always ask students this question: if you're angry with your partner and you go to the mall, what happens? Is it different than what would happen if you weren't angry at your partner? And for some people, they believe they'd spend more money if they weren't angry with their partner. And other people believe that they'd spend more if they were, right? Like, oh, I'm really upset. Let me spend money to cope. On the other hand, oh, things are going pretty all right. Let me just spend some money. Um, Another example of situational influence is what they call the sprinter effect. So, the sprinter effect is an effect where when you're highly involved in something and you have high self control, and that creates this high performance in task one, you jeopardize your performance in task two, right? So, essentially, let's say you're really highly motivated, I'll give you an example, to do well on my take home exam. You're highly involved. You want to make sure you get an A because you want to be an all A student, right? And you have great self control. You sit up and you even pull an all nighter writing out and making sure your answers make sense. You proofread a million times, so on and so forth, because you're dedicated. And because of that, you end up having high performance. I'd give you an A in the class. I'd give you an A plus if I could, right? But then the very next day, when you're like completely exhausted, you turned in your work at 11:59 p.m. exactly. You get a call at 5 a.m. from your boss saying, "Hey, can you cover for me, or can you take this shift?" Well, there's a very good chance that because you gave your all in the first task, i.e., doing well in my class, you have very little to give or less to give in the second task, right? Um, and that's kind of the sprinter effect that happens all the time. So I can give you another example. Let's say, you had a heck of a day at work, right? Everything was ridiculous. You were highly involved, but you stayed on track. You did exactly what you should do. You solved the problem at work. Things are going amazing, right? And then you walk into your house and you realize that the toilet is running And so someone needs to fix the toilet. And you say, hey, not today though, because I'm just really tired. I've given my all for work and I just don't have the energy. Right? Or your parents come over and say, hey, is it okay if we hang out? And you're like, no, you weren't invited and this is out of the blue, so not really. So, anyway, the sprinter effect just says that um, you may just do worse on a second unexpected task if you've given your all to the first task. And this would be a situational influence. How you perform on task 2 is situational because it's dependent on how you performed in task 1. I mentioned before that CB is interdisciplinary, but I have to be honest and say that we depend a lot on psychology, a lot, specifically social psychology. And so things that you see in social psychology do apply to the consumption, um, do apply to consumption behaviors and consumer behavior. So I'll give you an example. There is a paper put out in 2013 by someone who's in the psychology department here at Wayne State. I believe she's still here, called The Fear of Being Single. And basically, what they found is that people who are scared of being single don't necessarily say, hey, I'm going to lower my standards, right? So they still express that they want all of these things, right? However, even though they want all of these things, they find themselves, people who have this fear of being single, um, typically have greater romantic interest in people who are less responsive to them and less attractive, right? So they tend to date people who are less responsive than they'd like them to be and less attractive. Right? Why would they do that? They do it because they have a fear of being single, right? So, oh, maybe I can't find a guy who, will text me every day or check in on me, but at least I have a boyfriend. Oh, um, I'm scared of being single, so I decided to get this person who is a 4 on a scale of 1 to 10 rather than the 7 that I would prefer. Let me say up front, let me say now that I said that, I don't believe in rating people on these scales. I think it's really jerkish behavior, but I wanted to provide an example for this topic. So I want to give you an example of sociocultural influence. And I'm looking at the example comes from ethnic self-awareness. This concept that sometimes consumers are in a temporary state during which they're more sensitive to information related to their ethnicity, right? You could be in a temporary state of ethnic self awareness if you go to, let's say, a Black Lives Matter and you're black, or let's say you go to, um, you know, a church and every person there looks like you and you actually notice that. Some people won't even pay attention to that. But let's say you notice that and you become in this temporary state of really kind of thinking about your ethnicity, right? There are a million ways this can happen. We as researchers can prime you, right? We can put up a commercial that talks about your ethnicity to prime you to think about your ethnicity. Anyway, so, what some researchers found, and I love this study, it's in your reading list, is that if you expose people to an ethnic crime, and here prime is just something that you use to get people to pay attention, right? So you expose them to a picture of a Latinx person, you expose them to a picture of a black person, an Asian person, so forth, and it creates this ethnic self awareness. And when consumers are aware of themselves ethnically, what ends up happening is they respond more favorably to same ethnicity spokespeople and advertising that target their ethnicity. So if you are walking in a store and you're Latinx, um, you may very well not pay attention to magazines that are Latinx, right? On the other hand, if you've been primed to think about your ethnicity, maybe you were listening to Spanish music, or maybe you were thinking about, your grandma or something like this, and something she said about your ethnicity. You were in this temporary state. You then go to the grocery store and you pass these magazine articles like Parents, Latina, and you're thinking, wow, this really speaks to me. Another Latinx person, a mother, really speaks to me. Maybe I should buy this advertisement. This is one of the reasons that you don't see it as much today. But I would say about 10 years ago, 15 years ago, if you were watching BET, which is the Black Entertainment Network, almost every ad had black people. Right? Almost every single ad. Because a lot of times, most of the programming on the show catered to black people. And so people were primed to think about themselves as black people. And therefore, they would probably be more receptive to advertisement that showed a black person. I'm sure the exact same thing is true on other channels that target other ethnicities. I would also kind of venture to guess that it might not be as true for Caucasians or whites, mainly because white people in commercials or advertisements is typically the norm. So unless something really specifically happens to trigger ethnic self-awareness, I'm not sure that a white person would necessarily respond to a white person in an ad, but they might. I haven't really seen this tested. I'm just making some assumptions. And in fact, if you think that that's not true, feel free to shoot me an email with your argument. I'd love to hear it. I mean, truly, I would love to hear it. I'd be interested in hearing what people have to say about that. Um, yeah. Lastly, I'm going to give you an example of a marketing mix influence on consumer behavior. Um, how many people have eaten these 100-calorie packs? Not necessarily Doritos, but any kind of 100-calorie pack. Most of us have, right? And a lot of people who eat these packages think that these are packages that help them regulate their consumption, right? So essentially, they think, hey, if I buy these 100-pack snacks, this will help me because I'll eat one, and that's only 100 calories. Amazing. I'm winning. Yay for me. Um, and thank you to marketers for being so smart, right? Problem. Turns out when people have these 100-calorie packs, or what we call sub packaging, they actually eat more, right? So your plan is to eat 100 calories. So you're just going to eat one. And then next thing you know, you've eaten five. Why is that? Well, there's some research, and this is in your readings list. Is that says that when people are confronted with larger amounts or large package formats, they're more likely to deliberate about their consumption. So you're given, a whole family size bag of these Doritos, Cool Ranch Doritos, and you go, oh, that's a lot of Doritos. Let me just get one handful because these are very unhealthy. On the other hand, when the 100-calorie packs come into play, you think this is pretty healthy. And you don't think about moderating your consumption or minimizing your consumption. And so this is a marketing mix influence, right? So marketers, I'm going to guarantee you of this, probably went ahead and said we should do something to help people feel as though they're eating less. Why don't we do sub packaging? Yay, good idea. And I'm sure they did some research on this, and they probably know that sub packaging is kind of deceptive. They probably know that people are eating more than one, right? And so people were buying more of these little 100 packs, so on and so forth, which helps their bottom line. But again, very, very deceptive, I think. But good marketing practice, right? It's not deceptive in the sense that they're tricking you, but it's deceptive in the sense that you eat more than you plan to eat, right?